Welcome to everyone. I'm James Jensen, today's webinar chair. I'm a contractor supporting the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Today's webinar, titled Major Energy Project Agreements, is the 8th webinar of the 2020 DOE Tribal Energy Webinar Series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website in about 1 week. Copies of today's presentation slides will be posted to the Office of Indian Energy's website shortly after this webinar, if not before. In fact, I saw a link. I think they're already available. Everyone will receive a post-webinar email with the link to the page where the slides and recording will be located. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted. We will answer your written questions at the end of the final presentation. You can submit a question at any time by clicking on the question button located in the webinar control box on your screen and typing your question. Let's get started with opening remarks from Lizana Pierce. Ms. Pierce is Senior Engineer and Deployment Supervisor for the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs and duty stationed in Golden, Colorado. She oversees the deployment program, which is national in scope. Specifically, the deployment program includes financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and outreach. She also implements national funding opportunities and administers some of the resultant tribal energy project grants and agreements. She has over 25 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for the last 20+ years. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Colorado State University and pursued a Master's in Business Administration through the University of Northern Colorado. Lizana, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I join James in welcoming you to today's webinar. This webinar series is sponsored by the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, otherwise referred to as the Office of Indian Energy for short. So the Office of Indian Energy directs, fosters, coordinates, and implements energy planning, education, management, and programs that assist tribes with energy development, capacity building, energy infrastructure installation, reducing energy costs, and electrification of Indian homes and lands. To provide this assistance, our deployment program works within the Department of Energy, across government agencies, and with Indian tribes and organizations to help tribes and Alaska Native villages overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is composed of a three-pronged approach consisting of financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and capacity building. This Tribal Energy webinar series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. The webinar series is also part of the Office of Indian Energy's efforts to support fiscally responsible energy, business, and economic development decision making and information sharing amongst tribes. It is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, highlight tribal energy case studies, and identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and develop sustainable local economies. In today's webinar, we are focusing on large-scale energy projects and the contracts and agreements that are essential to their development. These agreements define all aspects of a project, including who gets the energy, how much is paid for the energy, what land is utilized, and what is the compensation for the use of that land, who will provide the capital for the construction, and how will that capital be returned, with many other aspects. Generally, large-scale projects have development timelines that may range from a couple of years to a decade or more. These longer timelines are indicative of the complexity and nature of the agreements that define and govern these projects. Today's webinar will not go into detail on any of these agreements, but is intended to provide you a general understanding of some of the most common contracts and agreements and the role they play in completing a successful project. We do hope the webinar and the series as a whole is useful to you, but we also welcome your feedback. So please let us know if there are ways that we can make the series better. Before I turn it back to James, I want to personally thank the presenters for giving up their time in preparing for and for presenting on today's webinar. Thank you. Thank you all. And with that, the virtual floor is yours, James.
Thank you, Lizana. Before we get to the presentations, I will introduce all of today's presenters. For our first presentation, we will hear from Mark Jacobson. Mark is a senior project leader at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Golden, Colorado. His career has spanned a diverse energy background with leadership positions beginning in energy efficiency program development and generation interconnection queue management, advancing on to utility-scale natural gas-fired electric generation development and utility-scale wind energy development, where Mark's development work resulted in the construction of over 1 gigawatt of electric generation, predominantly wind energy. Since joining NREL, his areas of work have been renewable resource assessments, energy development, capacity building, examination of new pumped storage hydropower technologies, and supporting the Air Force in their resiliency planning. Following Mark, we will hear from Edward Rios. Ed is a senior investment analyst for the U.S. Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office. He leads the analysis of loan guarantee applications received under the Tribal Energy Program and several other programs. Ed also is a key member of the Loan Program Office's outreach and business development activities. Ed has over 25 years of professional experience encompassing private sector work in chemical and manufacturing industries and government work supporting DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, DOE's Office of Information and Business Management Systems, the Department of Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs, and DOE's National Energy Technology Laboratory in Morgantown, West Virginia. Joining Ed is Todd Stribley. Todd has more than 25 years of environmental consulting experience with the past 10 years at the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office. His experience encompasses a wide variety of energy and infrastructure projects to include wind and solar energy projects, water supply and treatment infrastructure, nuclear energy projects, and fossil energy projects that include carbon capture, petroleum storage, liquefied natural gas terminals, and interstate pipeline projects. In his role with the Loan Programs Office, Mr. Stribley works with the applicants and project stakeholders to complete environmental reviews pursuant to the National Environmental Policy Act, as well as associated regulatory agency consultations under the Environmental Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. Our final presenter is Otto Van Giet. Otto is a principal engineer in the Integrated Application Center at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Among many other things, Otto's experience includes renewable energy screening and assessment, passive solar building design, solar photovoltaic system design for on and off-grid applications, energy audits, and minimizing energy use. Otto has authored many technical reports and conference papers and has been recognized with many awards from professional associations, including the 2007 Presidential Award for Leadership in Federal Energy Management and the 2011 GreenGov Green Innovation Presidential Award for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's Research Support Facility Data Center. He lives with his family in an off-grid passive solar home with 2 kilowatts of PV and a hybrid power system and solar hot water heating that he designed and built 20 years ago. Thanks to each of our presenters for making the time to join us today. With that, let's get started with our first presentation. Mark, you may proceed once your slides are up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks, James. I've given this presentation a number of times to different audiences, both domestic and international, frequently with audiences that are this large. There are probably a diverse set of interests in the development process and the contracting tools used within. I'll focus a bit more on the landowner role today, but it's important to understand all roles and their respective goals if you're going to successfully play your part in a project that gets built, and a successful project that gets built. I define all successful projects as ones that where you have concrete and steel in the ground and energy being generated. Energy development is a competitive business, and you're going to hear me repeat that a few times today in this presentation. My experience in energy development spans over 20 years with multiple technologies, natural gas, solar, and wind, but primarily wind. The big puzzle pieces are very similar within each, but the detailed approaches, permits, and some of the contracts can differ. Certainly, if you're using a different technology. I might have a few more slides that focus on wind development, since that's where the majority of my experience is in, but I'll try to tie in different technologies into those slides. And if there's something that's not clear or you want a deeper explanation, be sure to ask me during the Q&A. So let's go over the outline. So we'll talk a little bit about the goals of each party. I mentioned that before. We'll go through the wind development process. I really don't think you can understand the contracts without understanding the process. So we're going to go through that in a little bit more detail. And as I mentioned, we'll go through the contracts later. And then at the end, I got a quick fun little summary by pictures that I think you'll appreciate. So let's talk about the goals. So it's important for each party to understand the goals of the other. I think that's important in understanding the process. It's important when negotiating a contract. If you're too focused on your own goals, you're more likely to drive the other party away from working with you. You need to understand the market. You need to understand what the market approaches are and what the economics are for both your counterparty and yourself, and see how that might differ within the region of the country that you're in. Developers, as an example, need to acknowledge that it's not all about money too, right? When they're working with a landowner, whether it's a tribe or a private citizen, the land is kind of like a family member. And if you're not sensitive to those issues, sensitive to the fact that maybe it goes back generations, you're not going to be successful in working with that landowner. You're not going to be successful in signing a lease. The landowner needs to have a basic understanding of the competition that's out there, the market. If they ask too much for a royalty, if they ask too much for the placement of a Met tower, top developers are going to look for a different project to look at. You need to understand that when you're looking at whether it's wind or solar, whatever that project might be, even geothermal, there are different sites that can be used because of the fact that the electric system, the grid is interconnected. So you could have a competition where you have one project in Oklahoma competing with another project in Kansas, competing with another project in another state. So that competition is important to keep in front of you. Off-takers need to understand what the market rate of power is, depending on what the wind resource is or the solar resource. An example I like to use of a mistake that was made by utilities, and this was quite a while ago, well over a decade, maybe 15 plus years ago, was in California when they didn't quite understand what the cost was, what the return was that was needed by developers when they went out for an RFI for their renewable resources. And there was a period of time where 70% of the projects that were awarded through their RFP processes failed, never made it to financing, never were built. And that was because, again, they didn't understand the goals and the needs of the developer. So it's important for each party, the developer, the landowner, the off-taker, to really understand the goals of the other in a basic way so that all three can be successful. Next slide, please. So I love to describe the development process with the analogy of the three-legged Milken stool. I'm an old farm boy from Indiana, and that probably has something to do with it. We were just corn and beans, but all my family members were Milken farmers. And the reason why I love this analogy is it describes the three legs of development. You need to understand the market, you need to understand your resource, and you need to understand the land. Now, there's subcategories underneath each of those. Now, in this photo, I have wind resource, but substitute that for any energy resource, whatever the resource is for the project that you're looking at. If you're really good at two of them, but you're not very good and you fail at understanding the third leg, then the stool tips over and you've got a failed project. You really need to understand all three legs to have a successful project. And another way to look at this is with all three of those legs, understanding, researching, getting information, and getting contracts signed, you're de-risking the project. So as a developer, as a landowner, you want to understand that a developer is trying to do just that. They're trying to de-risk the project, because when it's time to compete and to market the project to an off-taker, usually it's not just lowest price, it's lowest price with the lowest risk project wins. And so if you're on board with the developer, this is again that trying to understand the goals of each party. If you understand that we're trying to de-risk the project, then I think we get to the finish line faster. Next slide, please. So we're going to go briefly into these three different legs, and I like to start with the market. Understanding who your buyers are is important. If you don't understand who they are, then of course you're not going to go sell the power. And what I find is interesting here over the last 5 years, probably started 10 years ago a little bit, but has picked up quite a bit in the last 5 years, is that the buyers are not just utilities. There's a lot of corporate buyers out there right now. And for whatever buyer group you're looking at, you need to understand what their drivers are. Is there an RPS, a renewable portfolio standard in their state, in their region, that's requiring the utility to buy a certain percentage of power from renewables? If it's a corporate buyer, do they have in their annual report, do they have a requirement in their sustainability goals to buy a certain percentage of renewables? Where are they within that process? Transmission, I consider that a part of the market. Many times the transmission line that you're connecting to, at least in the old days, was the utility that you were selling the power to. That's not necessarily the case anymore. You can use that line to sell that power to another utility that has transmission rights, or you as the developer can purchase transmission rights to move that power to another region of the country and sell that power to your customer. Another little fun poll here. I got a couple of polls within this presentation that I think might be help drive home the fact that the customer group is changing. Let's move to the next slide. I guess you have, okay. Corporate buyers like Amazon and Google have been large purchasers in recent years, and I'm comparing them to utilities. What percentage of wind energy PPAs are being signed by corporate buyers in the US today? Now, this is a 2019 number. And I'll just be quiet here for a second or two and let you kind of crystallize that answer in your mind, what you think it might be. And for those of you that thought it was 40%, you would be right, because that's the right answer. I think 2017 was the first time that I saw that from a transaction perspective, more than 50% of the transactions, the PPAs, were being signed by corporate buyers. That there's two different winners here. You can be looking at it from a megawatts perspective or a transaction perspective, and now it's the megawatts are picking up. It started off with being more transactional, and now it's moving to the megawatt side. If you move to the next slide, just a quick little flyer here that demonstrates that Walmart and AT&T were two of the top 3 buyers last year of wind power, and the 5 gigawatts of the 8.7 gigawatts that were signed up was the second highest amount for utility wind purchases. So last year, 2019, was a big year for both of those groups. Moving on to the next slide. So we'll just hit transmission risk here, transmission, this particular task here for a little bit. it's important to understand that during that development cycle as a landowner, there's a lot of different things going on at the same time, and the developer is, if he's comfortable with some of this early due diligence, working with landowners, working with the tribe, looking at the population density, the wildlife issues and concerns, and cultural issues, making sure that each of them there's a pathway towards success. And he's probably going to invest in transmission studies, and those aren't cheap. Usually they break up into 3 different studies: a feasibility study, a system impact study, and a facility study. That helps them identify the number of megawatts that might be available on the line, and identifies actual facilities and some budgetary costs associated with interconnecting to that line, and who's responsible for those. Not all the costs would be paid by the developer. Some might be paid by the utility if it's a network upgrade. And that's frequently like $250,000 to get started in get your studies. That's a down payment for your studies as you get started down that path of signing a large generator interconnection agreement. There's usually decision gates along the way that if it's not looking good, you can stop those studies. Summarizing this leg 1 of the market, you need to understand again who your buyers are, what their drivers are, and the transmission rights that you might have to access or to be able to move power in their direction. Let's move to leg number 2. Now, the wind resource, I'm not going to spend that much time talking about it, because we could probably talk about this for 2 hours. But for completeness in this presentation and identifying the fact that this is an important part of the leg, and working with landowners, once you've looked at some larger regional maps, eventually you're going to need to get real wind data on that site. And that's what the banks are going to be looking for. And usually they're looking for 2 years of data, on-site data, multiple locations. And that's usually covered in a option agreement, or it can be covered as a option section within a full lease agreement, where these rights of the developer to work with the landowner to identify where they're going to put these meteorological towers. That's usually identified in a full lease. Let's move to the next slide, please. This one I'm going to not talk that much about, but I'm just using it for a visual. There's a lot that goes into fully understanding what the wind resource is, or what well, specifically a wind resource. And there's a number of different studies and contracts that are signed with independent wind researchers that help move yourself down the path for de-risking the project from a energy resource side, and that will be eventually presented to a bank, or actually first presented to maybe a power purchaser, but eventually a bank, which will secure your financing, allow you to build the project. Moving on to the next slide. So the third leg is land. And again, there's a lot of subcategories here. It's important to understand what type of ownership we're talking about. Is it tribal trust land? Is it private land? Is it state? What's that usage profile? What's the population density? How many homes? How close are you to a village? What's the wildlife and environmental issues look like for that particular parcel? Many times, for projects that I've worked on, you rarely have the ability to work with just one type of landowner. There's usually multiple landowners that you're looking at that make up a project boundary, because the projects are getting bigger and bigger nowadays. And that requires you to build have the need to work with multiple types of landowners and understand what their permitting requirements are. The legal contracts might differ depending on the landowner that you're working with. Next slide, please. So this is a visual that I think is important to understand. And it's demonstrating wake effect, and it's related to land, because frequently when I talk with landowners, they're always asking, why do you need so much land for these wind farms? And what we're learning is that the disturbed air behind a turbine stretches out for a lot longer than we originally thought. And it's negatively affecting the power production of downwind turbines more than we originally thought. And so by modeling a turbine layout and understanding these negative effects of wake, we can minimize, you can't eliminate, but you can minimize the actual negative effects of wake on energy production by really looking hard and strategically locating and siting those turbines. You can also, there's some new technology, control technology that we're working on and finalizing here at NREL. We can actually steer that wake around downwind turbines by putting a control device on every single turbine and actually yawing the rotor assembly one way or another and steering that wake a little bit past the downwind turbines and increase the energy usage or energy production of the entire wind farm. So that's another thing that's being done. But as a landowner, I think it's important to know these concerns. And so when working with developers and siting turbines on specific areas, there's a lot of thought and process in siting those turbines to get the maximum energy production so that they can get the lowest power price so that they can market their project more effectively. Again, it's that competition word. So all these things are related. Get a lot of land, so you got a lot of room to move with the siting, and or have flexibility with the siting so that you can get the most power production, increase the chances of winning a PPA. Next slide, please. Not going to talk much about this slide, but again, these are some of the tools that are used by the developer. And sometimes I've had landowners sit down side by side with me and I show them how with wind farm or open wind, I'll show them how moving a turbine one direction or another can affect the power production of 6, 8, 10 turbines behind it. And again, having that better understanding of the different elements of the project, build that trust with the landowner team and make them feel a part of the team. I think that's always an important element in wind development, is to make the landowners realize that they are a team member, and sharing this kind of information, I think helps solidify that. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand, again, from a schedule perspective, what it takes to get the land, get the lease agreement signed and the permitting complete. And it usually takes 2 to 3 years. I've seen it take longer sometimes. Sometimes you'll have groups of 2 to 10 people working on a really large project so that they can have multiple expansions over time. But understanding the schedule, I think, can be an opportunity for a landowner group. Again, getting back to understanding the competition, understanding the fact that if I can help as a landowner team help complete the acquisition and permitting process in 1.5 years instead of 3 years, maybe match it up with the transmission studies that are being done at that time. There might be a key RFP, request for proposal, the utility might have that allows the power marketing to start in earnest with that developer and show that the project has been de-risked in this particular area. It's more mature. It's another word that I like to use. You're trying to show that your project is more mature. And that can be an advantage in marketing the project. Next slide. So, this doesn't happen overnight. What's going on in these 2 to 3 years of working through the lease issues, the wildlife issues, the cultural issues and studies that maybe are going on. It's meeting with people, and you just can't spend enough time on site meeting with tribal leaders or county commissioners or key landowners. It's spending a lot of time answering questions and making them feel comfortable with the process. There's a lot of handouts and leave behinds where it's not just conversations, it's information that's being left behind, customized to their area, and showing them what the personal economics are for their decision, getting them comfortable with the land displacement, getting them comfortable with what the equipment looks like and how big it will be when it comes on site to build the project. This kind of slides me into a poll question. This is specific to wind, I know, but this is my last poll question, but again, just kind of teases the mind a little bit. For a typical utility scale wind project of 20, and they're not usually 20 megawatts anymore, but 20 to 100 megawatts, what's the percentage of land that's permanently displaced by the turbine pad? This includes the kind of apron of gravel that's around the tower itself, the access roads, and the substation. I'll just wait a couple seconds, let you kind of look at that and crystallize an answer in your head. For those of you that thought it was the lowest number, 1%, you'd be right. It's just a really small amount of land. Now, there's a little bit more that's used during construction that might pop up to 5% because you'll have a laydown area. The turbine pad is maybe twice as big at each individual turbine site, and this takes away cropland or rangeland. But once it's all been restored, and you're just taking if you go to the next slide, this kind of breaks it out into some detail. It'll show you the amount of land that is displaced because of the turbine, the amount of land that's displaced because of the road, the substation, and kind of shows you how you get to that number of 1% and sometimes less when you're talking about the larger projects. On that right-hand column, you can see for the small project, it's about 1.2% of total land displaced, down to 0.5% when you're talking about a larger project. This is a handout that if you're a landowner, you should be receiving from a developer as they're walking you through what the project is going to look like. It's going to be a little bit different for solar, right? So this is wind. If it was solar, that's the difference between those two project developments. With wind, it's such a small amount of land that's displaced. You're using a lease agreement because 99% of the land can still be used for grazing or for corn or beans. If it's solar, the land that is going to be used is pretty much fully displaced, and those are usually purchase agreements. So you might have a purchase option agreement that is signed if you're looking to participate as a landowner in a solar solar project. Usually 5 to 7 acres per megawatt is needed. And so for the large utility scale projects, you can still be, you might be selling 100 or 200 acres of land for a solar project. For a wind project, they're looking at, for a utility scale project, they're usually, you see here, 7,500 acres. I usually never worked with anything less than 10,000 acres because you always want to have a buffer room from competition that might pop up in the future, or have enough land for the expansion. So you got more land, bigger footprint for wind, smaller for solar, but you got a lease agreement for wind and usually a purchase agreement for solar. Next slide. So this is also an important template or handout that I would share with landowners. And this is when you're continuing to move the discussion along and building the trust up with the landowner. They're interested in participating in a project, and now you're starting to talk about money. You're starting to talk about economics, and all three of these payments are usually covered within the lease agreement. So these are not separate agreements. It's all covered in one agreement. And the development payment usually covers the first 3 to 5 years. And if you haven't got a PPA signed, there's usually an element within the contract that says if the developer hasn't signed a PPA within 5 years, the contract is automatically null and void. So that's important to make sure that element is within the contract. I think that's pretty standard nowadays, but especially if you're dealing with a top developer. There's also a construction payment, also called a restoration or reclamation payment. Those are all three names for basically the same thing. If you damage the land, there's description in there of what that payment per acre usually is, and that's again one time for that one. It's a one-time payment for that one incident, so it's a per incident payment. You might pay this for access when the Met Tower is put up during that development period. You definitely are going to pay it during construction. And in year 16 or 17, there might be a repair where a new blade needs to be installed, and you bring a crane out and you damage 10 acres driving the crane out and assembling it and replacing the blade. And then this would be triggered, and you'd be paid over and above your operations payment, which is the last and biggest number, of course, right? And that usually can be structured in two different ways. I always think of the Mississippi River as the determining factor of whether a lease agreement will use the percentage of gross revenue or the dollars per megawatt fixed payment option. Kind of interesting. I think usually ranches west of the Mississippi are familiar with oil and gas royalty payments and the lease agreements associated with oil and gas, and so they're very comfortable with a sharing option, a percentage of gross. East of the Mississippi, maybe a little bit more suspicious. They don't have a familiarity with oil and gas leases, and so they tend to go with the fixed payment of dollars per megawatt. In the end, they tend to be very similar in the total payment, but the structure is different depending on where you are in the United States. And the period of time is usually 20 to 25 years for that first term, and then usually they'll have option agreements that can be 10 years or another 25 years, making that full agreement 50 years. That ability to show I understand option agreements maybe don't work as well within some of the tribal lease agreements that I've read about, but just letting you know how that connects to the ability to market the power. If you've got an ability to, it's usually the developer's option to exercise the extended option period. That can be another way of sweetening the pot when they're marketing the project to a utility or corporate buyer, saying that if you enjoyed the first 25 years, you'll enjoy the next 25 years or the next 10 years, whatever that option period is. So that's used during the marketing of the project. Of course, these numbers are kind of focused on an average, the center part of the U.S., Midwest and West. It's very regional. So California, these numbers are a lot big. California and New York, East Coast and West Coast, these numbers are much higher. Next slide. Again, all these are, these worksheets are actual props that are used in working with the landowner in preparation to sign a land lease. But you got to be very comfortable and familiar with what those economics are, so that when it's time to turn it into contract language, you know where the backup material is. How'd you get to that number? And this one I found to be very powerful. I actually developed this and found it to be very useful in working with landowners, where instead of just generally writing a number down on a piece of paper and saying, well, this is how much we're going to pay you for the turbine, does that look good or not? I always felt it was good to work a landowner through what their economics were per acre. And that's what the left-hand side of this worksheet is doing. What kind of revenue are they getting for corn or beans? What are their expenses? What's the cost of seed, fertilizer, water, labor? A lot of times the farms have been handed down to through generations, so there's maybe no taxes, or no mortgage payment, but sometimes there is. And so if so, we would include that number on there as well. But you arrive at a net profit. If you're renting your land out for as rangeland or pasture land to cattle, well, we put that down there as a revenue number per acre. And then on the right-hand side, we write down what the proposal is for wind or for solar, and show you how much money you would make here on a per acre basis. So you're kind of talking in the same language as the landowner, dollars per acre. And at the very bottom, they can make a apples to apples comparison on what they would make one versus the other. And this can be very eye-opening, I think, for a landowner, because when you are looking at it on a per acre basis, it's usually much more profitable to host a wind farm or host a solar farm, solar array, and to see how it looks in comparison to base case, I think is important. Next slide. And of course, you don't do this right from the beginning, but eventually, as you're realizing that the project is maturing, that you have the tribal leadership or the county buy-in, and this project is going to move forward, you want to make sure that you kind of extend out your community outreach. This might be making presentations at local schools, at Rotary groups, answering questions for all the landowners that maybe themselves are not going to be participating or hosting the turbine, but might be living near it, right? Again, it's trying to show transparency, and I think that's important. Next slide. So on this next slide, I kind of reworked it. This is a slide that I had generated before for the county. With the tribe, I know that would be, you're looking at it differently, right? You don't really, are not taxing like a county, but you might have a PILT, if you're familiar with that acronym, PILT, payment in lieu of taxes. You might want to have definitely would want to have some revenue stream that's coming in that's going to help help repair our roads and other infrastructure issues associated with a energy plant that's located in your community. So you might identify, and you're going to negotiate what that number might be. It might be one time, it might be multiple times, it might be an annual number, but you could look at that and add this to your, what you would call your revenue, your royalty payment, and get a sense of what your annual revenue stream is going to look like in total, breaking it up into each of these payment streams. And you can also add another column. I've done this before too, where you add it up over the full 25 years of a power purchase agreement and see what that project revenue looks like. Also, this is something that we frequently provide a community economics worksheet as we look at the direct jobs generated. You see that down there at the bottom of this worksheet. Usually there's 120 to 200 workers per 100 megawatt project, 8 to 10 operational jobs, and the indirect jobs can be 100 to 200 as well for a 100 megawatt project. Jobs, engineering jobs, hotel, restaurant, hardware store, a lot of different indirect jobs, not necessarily associated directly with construction, but are generated when a project comes into your community. And it's good to kind of document that number, or manage your expectations of all the benefits that's going to be generated in your community. And landowners, I think, like to have that expectation managed. Next slide. So now sliding into looking at the components of an actual land lease. Some of this I've covered, but I'm not going to go into this in a ton of detail, but I want to pick out different parts and kind of focus on it a little bit. And give you some key takeaways. One of the suggestions that or recommendations I have for landowners is looking at that option agreement. You can, and I might suggest that you do include some performance deadlines for a developer in number one there, the option agreement. There are some developers out there that will sign you up and then put the project on a shelf and not really advance it or try to mature it over time. I always like to add in there, my recommendation for landowners is to add in there, within 6 months, you'll install a Met tower. Maybe within 18 months, you'll install 2. Maybe within 18 months or 2 years, you'll initiate a transmission study, interconnection study. And of course, if they don't do that, the contract is null and void. Kind of puts them on notice that you want them to move this project along. And you can have some cure rates. They can maybe explain why they didn't do it, but why they didn't move something forward, but it gives you some control during that option period. We talked a little bit about these operational payments and the restoration payments. So I'm not going to duplicate my explanation there. So moving on to the next slide. So these are other components of a land lease. You're going to have a lot of promises, covenants situated underneath the lessor side. That's the landlords, the landowners side of the ledger, and basically it's saying that for the land itself, any taxes, and I know that maybe is not necessarily. It's going to be different with a tribe versus a private landowner. But any kind of insurance that's required just for the land, that's still the responsibility of the lessor. Certainly any facilities, any equipment that's brought onto the land, that kind of insurance, those kinds of taxes associated with the improvements, that's the responsibility of the lessee. One of the items, though, that I wanted to bring up is, it gets a lot of discussion when negotiating these contracts, is the bullet there, sub-bullet called obstructions. Of course, and this is something just to think through, and as long as you talk about it ahead of time and have it written into the contract, there are no surprises and no concerns. But you wouldn't want a big elevator or grain bin built right in front of a turbine. Certainly, you can continue all other ag businesses or activities associated with the with a farm or a ranch, but you build something tall and big in front of the turbine, that's usually an issue. Building something where a collection line goes through, if it's a solar farm, that can be an issue. So I want to just kind of talk through those issues, and none of them are something that can't be resolved, and maybe you can identify where you'd want a future grain bin, so that that's included in the siting of the project before anything's built. Next slide. Again, not going to run through every single one of these bullets, but one I'll pick out and talk a little bit about is, or two actually. One is, again, just having good communication between you, the landowner, and the developer. I would, when I worked with ranchers and farmers, and looking at their entire land, it was important to always ask, what kind of, what's the future look like for you? Do you have a home that you wanted to build somewhere? Were you going to section off a piece of land for a son or a daughter, and kind of identifying where those parcels were going to be, and maybe we would have a stay away zone where we wouldn't build any. We'd actually write that into the contract. There'd be a schedule to the contract. We'd make sure that we wouldn't build a turbine on that site, or we wouldn't run a collection line, buried collection line through that area that they planned on building a retirement home in, or selling to a family member. So that was always something to always make sure that you, again, have that good communication in those future plans of development. If you're going to build a casino in a particular area, where would that be? And let's make sure we carve that out and put that into the survey and attach that to the lease as a schedule. Removal of equipment or decommissioning. There's usually a small reference to that in the lease. Usually more detailed description of the decommissioning plan and a bond that usually the developer puts up. It can be a letter of credit or a performance bond. That's a detail that sometimes is in a county document, but with tribal land, all that detail probably would show up in the land lease itself. So again, no surprises. You know what that plan is for decommissioning, and there's money set aside for it. Next slide. So I think we, throughout this presentation, kind of covered some of these best practices, talking about things that I would do within a land lease that would maybe help you out as a lessor. The other thing, I guess I didn't, two of the things I would focus on here on this slide are the last two bullets. Always have an energy attorney review. Someone that has real estate experience usually can cover it as well. Never make the decision on your own. Always have a professional attorney take a look at it and have you represent in these negotiations. And lastly, and this is actually reverse on the timeline, before you make a decision to sign an agreement, talk with a county commissioner or another tribe that has hosted a wind farm, and even if it's a cold call, you don't even know who they are, just ask them the experiences that they have had. There's a lot of concerns, sometimes myths that are thrown out there during the development of a project that are either not true at all, or the emphasis isn't as strong. If you're talking to a county commissioner or someone that has a project located in their county, you say, well, that flicker issue really wasn't an issue. We've had only one complaint over 12 years. So you get a sense of emphasis, how big of a problem something might be. Next slide. Right of way, setback variance. This is another agreement that is a part of a project. I got 5 minutes here, and I promise to get done in the next 4 minutes. But this is an agreement that is a little bit not quite as detailed as a lease agreement. It can be much shorter, covers a lot of the same topic areas, but it's a right of way that sometimes I've called a setback variance that can be used for many different purposes. One could be just access during construction or during O&M. Maybe a landowner, there's no need to have facilities like a turbine or a solar array or a collection system run through their land, but maybe during construction they need to have access via to run trucks or a crane through, and an agreement like that can be signed and useful, and usually it's typically a one-time payment. A setback variance is one where maybe at the edge of your project boundary, the edge of your land, you're going up against someone else's land, and you'd like to move the turbine closer to the fence line, but there's a 20-foot setback variance, or a 50-foot setback variance, or a 110-foot setback variance. Setback within the zoning requirements of that nearby neighbor. So we'd sign up the neighbor for the variance agreement that allows us to move that turbine closer to your fence line and out of out of the field, or just moves it closer to the edge. But we pay the neighbor an annual fee to do that. We call that a setback variance. It's also very similar to a right-of-way agreement. Next slide. Interconnection agreement. I think I'm going to skip through this because I talked a little bit about it at the very beginning. But it's another agreement that the developer is signing at the end of all the interconnection studies that have been completed. And then the power purchase agreement. Next slide. Is the last major agreement that's signed during this entire development cycle. And that's an agreement that the developer is signing with either a utility or a corporate buyer, and these are very competitive, as I mentioned, and they're usually not signed unless the project has reached a certain level of maturity. So the prices can really depend on where you are in the country. We're seeing the average price. I saw a report the other day that the average price, I think in 2019 was less than $20 a megawatt hour for the PPAs here in the U.S. Majority of those projects were in what I call the wind tunnel of the U.S. in the central part where the wind is strong, so the resource was strong. That was down to less than $20 a megawatt hour. Compare that to wholesale power prices, which are in the 20s and $30 per megawatt hour, and that's very, very competitive. Prices are continuing to drop. Project sizes are going up. You're looking at a 2 megawatt turbine now, where previously you were looking at a 1 megawatt turbine 7-8 years ago. But the takeaway here from this slide is that once you, and it flows into the next 2 or 3 slides, is that during that development process, you are trying to mature your project. You're trying to de-risk it. You'll not get a PPA signed until you've reached that certain level of maturity, and you won't get project financing until you've gotten the PPA signed. So it's all connected. And if we move down to the next slide, 31, the pro forma slide, 29 and 30 just kind of summarize what I talked about. 31 is the pro forma. Gives you a sense of these individual buckets of costs that the developer is trying to get clarity on, and he uses this to price his project. And this just, I thought, would be a good reference point for you if you want to take this PowerPoint home and look at it a little bit further. To summarize, and I'll be able to do this in about 30 seconds. If you go to the next slide, I think this is kind of a fun summary in pictures. Slide 33, go to the next slide, please. You're prospecting for your best sites as a developer, talking with lots of landowners. You're starting to whittle down to the very best sites. Next slide. Next. And from these sites that you've identified on your laptop, now you're actually going out and meeting with landowners because you've found your best sites. You're talking through different land deals, and you're starting to mature that project with each individual landowner. And you have a lot of kitchen table discussions, hundreds of them, and that helps keep a project moving forward. In the next slide, work through your wildlife and cultural issues. Next slide. Next slide. And then you start talking to the community and making sure that you're expanding your level of communication so that everyone's on board with what the project's going to look like. And that slides you into the next slide. Finish your modeling and your layout, and you know exactly where all your facilities are going to be located. And that advances the project to the next slide. You get your contract signed. Your financing is complete. Your next slide. You start pouring concrete. The next slide. Start bringing very large components. Next slide. This is the most talked about and most photographed picture within any project construction. That's flying up the rotor assemblies. You'll have the whole community coming out taking pictures when this happens. The next slide. When that's done, you'll start operating your wind farm and collecting royalty checks. And the next slide, if you're looking for a job, you can maybe help maintain some of these turbines by cleaning off blades. That's not for me, but it might be for you. Thanks, appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. Excellent presentation. A lot of interesting stuff in there. And a reminder, the slides will be available, posted on our website, so people can reference those later as needed. With that, we're moving on to our next presentation. Ed Rios, go ahead. Your slides are up.
Thanks very much, James. And I want to thank Mark as well, because he covered some of the project agreements that are also very important for our program. So thanks, Mark, for doing some of the work for me. I'm very excited to be speaking with all of you. I've spoken with the tribal community in the past, but one of my joys is communicating and relaying the types of programs that we have to help tribes. And so today I want to give you a flavor of what the Loan Programs Office does, specifically with the focus on the tribal energy program. Next slide. So if you would like a good analogy of what the LPO is, it's a bank. It's really a bank with a specialized focus. So we finance energy projects or energy infrastructure. So what I'd like to do is just give you a background of what we've done, and then move into a focus on tribal energy and how it can apply to federally recognized tribes. Next slide. So let's start off with some numbers. We have over $40 billion available in loan capacity for energy development. And so with that in mind, the projects that we do tend to be large. We've gone with a range of maybe 30, 40, 50 million, all the way up to several $billion dollars. With our sweet spot maybe in the 300 to 400, $500 million range. So we tend to fill that niche of financing where commercial lenders may not want to go without other assistance, without other partners. But what we what's special about us is we can do the entire amount of funding and not have to involve other lenders. Secondly, we're very flexible. So we have different loan products. We have different structures that we can entertain. We are not cookie cutter, for sure. Our projects can be very complex, and as a result, we've become very good at being flexible to meet the needs of the project. And finally, what also makes us very special is that we stick with the project. We don't turn around and sell projects after we fund them. We stick with the project because there is a lot of expertise that we offer that many banks can't. And one of those is our deep technical expertise. We have the national labs behind us. We have the other program offices that we can access. And so there's a lot of in-house expertise that we bring to the table that we can access when a project may be encountering some difficulties. So we're committed to the project. Next slide, please. Here's a flavor of what the number of projects and where we've done our projects. You know, our portfolio is mostly solar. I would say a large percentage of them are solar. So you'll see that there's a cluster of projects in Nevada, Arizona, California. But we've also done wind projects in Oregon. We've done geothermal projects. We've done a nuclear project in Georgia. We've done auto manufacturing facilities. So we run the gambit of the sectors across the country. Next slide. Here's a little breakdown, just so you have a flavor. Our nuclear portfolio is quite a chunk because nuclear projects are very expensive. We've done a project in Georgia called the Vogel project, which is about $12 billion in total. It's over 2 loans. But you can see we've done some very large wind projects, auto manufacturing. In case you didn't know, we actually offered the first loan to Tesla when they were getting started on their commercialization of their vehicles. Next slide, please. So the breakdown of money. So there's 3 main programs under the office. There's the Tribal Energy Program, the Title 17, which is our Innovative Energy Program, and the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Program, which is ATVM for acronyms, because we love acronyms in the government. So you'll hear me use those a lot. And tribal energy, we like to say, we call it TELP for short, the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program. Each one of these programs has a pot of money assigned to it. Tribal Energy has up to $2 billion. And I can tell you that it is all available. It has not been used yet. One reason for that is Tribal Energy is our newest program. We started it a couple years ago. And so we have gotten interest, but we haven't been able to close a loan yet, which is why we are working hard to get the word out about the program. And I hope that the audience will feel free to contact me if they do have any projects in mind. I would certainly welcome an opportunity to speak with you and discuss the project with you. The other 2 programs, Title 17, ATVM, make up the remainder of the $40 billion. So we have a lot of money at our disposal, needless to say. Next slide, please. So let's focus on tribal. What are we trying to do? So tribal energy is a very special program. because we are not focused on innovative technologies. We are not focused on auto manufacturing. We are focused on tribal energy development projects. And why is that? It's because there are some tribes who have a lot of resources at their disposal. But because they don't have a lot of expertise with financing, those resources can lay dormant. And so with the Department of Energy getting involved, our goal is to alert the commercial markets that we are standing alongside this project and are willing to guarantee the project if lenders are willing to underwrite it. And so if that happens, then, and we are able to successfully fund the construction of a tribal energy project, we hope that the tribe then gains experience in the development of energy projects and is able to then go out into the commercial markets on their own and get financing to develop the rest of their resources. Now, we are certainly here to continue to provide support. So tribes can certainly come back to us, but we hope that there is some expertise that's developed so that tribes are able to access commercial markets more easily. So what would be an eligible project? So first of all, the project has to be owned by the tribe, or at least be majority owned if it's not, if there is a joint venture where there is a tribe and a non-tribe that owns the project. So let me say that again. The project can either be 100% owned by the tribe, or there can be a joint venture between a tribe and a non-tribe, tribal entity that owns the project, as long as the tribe is the majority owner, which means greater than 50%. We want to be sure that tribes have control of their energy projects. Secondly, the project has to be located in the US or its territories, which means that it does not have to be on tribal land. It can certainly be located on non-tribal land. As long, what we are hoping is that the project will benefit the tribe in some way, shape, or form. And that's really what we would like to see. Third, because we're not a grant program and we are a lending program, the project has to be financially viable. We have to be assured that it will be able to repay the loan. And Mark did a really great job of describing the types of agreements that give us that comfort. So for an electricity generation project, we certainly need to see the power purchase agreement. We would certainly need to see a wind study if it's a wind project, or maybe a solar study if it's a solar project. We would want to see a construction plan, and eventually we'd want to see the construction contracts for that. We would want to see the investor agreements. Again, remember that the project is owned by tribe or a joint venture between tribe and non-tribal entities. So we'd want to see those agreements to see, are they contributing some of their own money into the project? We want to see the interconnection studies to make sure that the project is able to hook in without any problems. So those agreements that Mark has described form the basis for our analysis and give us the comfort and validate the assumptions that the developer is making so that we can be assured that the project can repay our loan. And finally, the innovation requirement. The only reason that's in there is because if you are familiar with LPO, we are known for the innovative aspect of our portfolio, where we fund first-of-a-kind technologies. However, for tribal energy, that is not a requirement. We can certainly fund commercially available technologies. That is not a problem. We actually prefer that because they're less risky. Okay? What kinds of technologies can we fund? We can do it all. We can do fossil, renewable, we can do infrastructure, meaning pipelines. We can do transmission lines. We can do fuel. Really, we are all of the above in terms of the sectors that we can touch. Next slide. I did talk about this a little bit. I did talk about the eligible tribe. An eligible tribe would be a federally recognized tribe or Alaska Native Corporation. That's usually pretty easy for us to verify. A tribal energy development organization is what I described as the joint venture between a tribe and a non-tribal entity. But it must have majority ownership by the tribe. The equity portion. So we do require that the owners, the tribe or the tribal energy development organization, contribute their own money into the project. How much is something that we would negotiate on. But this gives us assurance that there is skin in the game by the tribe, so that there is an incentive for the tribe to stay in the project. And finally, we do require that any project that gets a loan guarantee from us have a credit rating from one of the recognized rating agencies of BB or higher. Okay, next slide, please. So how would the tribe be involved in this process? So first of all, they would be the borrower of the funds. They would approach lenders, commercial lenders, to gauge their interest and willingness to fund the project. Obviously, they would develop and identify the energy development activity. And finally, they would engage with the Loan Programs Office to begin pre-application consultations. Now, the importance of a pre-application consultation is that this process is complex, and it does require some money from the borrower. So before that happens, before the resources are spent, we certainly would welcome and encourage any tribe to approach us and begin these consultations, which are free of charge, so that the borrower is very familiar with what to expect, and that could get a good sense of whether the project would be successful in our program. This is really important because it avoids all kinds of confusion and heartache because the process is complex. Next slide, please. As I was saying, there is a lender that's involved, a commercial lender. And that commercial lender is the applicant to our program. So even though the tribe is the borrower, the lender or the bank would be the one that's applying to us. And that's because what we furnish is a guarantee to that lender. If we agree with the terms, if we feel like the project that has been developed between the lender and the tribe has merit, then the Department of Energy would be willing to guarantee the loan of up to 90% if the borrower weren't able to repay it. And this is why lenders would hopefully feel comfortable with dispersing those funds for the project. And so we have to be really familiar with the lender. We have to have a relationship with the lender as well and make sure that they understand where we come from and where our requirements are. And so that is another role that's very important in all this process. Next question, next slide, please. There's a couple things I do want to highlight on this slide is that, again, we guarantee up to 90% of the debt. There is no money that's coming from us unless the borrower cannot repay. So ideally, the money would be coming from the lender, and we would just be monitoring and making sure that all the covenants and requirements are met. Another unique aspect is the length of the loan term can be up to 30 years, which is really unheard of in the commercial sector. So we certainly can go very long with the understanding that the agreements also go long. Obviously, the power purchase agreement would be one case where would determine that length, but we certainly can entertain those types of terms. Next slide, please. So here's a very quick timeline of what the process looks like. I've already talked to you about the pre-application consultation. If we come to a point in those consultations where, yes, we think you have a project that has merit, we'll encourage you to apply. Then the formal application process begins, where we begin our preliminary analysis. There are requirements that you have to furnish, which is described in the solicitation. All this information is, by the way, is available on our website, of course. And then if the preliminary review during the application submission looks good, we'll move you into due diligence, where we start negotiating the terms of the loan guarantee. If we can come to terms, then that goes through our approval process, where it then leaves the loan program office and is reviewed by the senior management of the Department of Energy, as well as the Department of Treasury and the Department of the Office of Management and Budget. And then finally, we get to the last phase, which is loan closing. And that's basically when the approval process is completed and it's successful. We officially close the loan on the loan guarantee agreement, and we can start, construction can start. And then the project then moves into another group within our office who will monitor the construction and the operations of the project. Next slide, please. So I really appreciate the time and your attention. Obviously, this is a wonderful program that I hope that many of you can contact me about. I hope that there are projects out there that we can assist with. We are eager to assist any of you with any of these financing type projects. You'll see my name, Edward Rios, and my contact information. I hope you please write that down and do not hesitate to contact me. And with that, I'll end it, and I want to thank all of you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Thanks very much. And I know you have to hurry off to another meeting. So we had one question come in that I think might be appropriate for you if you have time and are able to answer it. It says, how many applicants have come into the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program at this time?
You know, unfortunately, that's not public information, so I have to politely decline. I can say that the entire $2 billion is still there, so it hasn't been used. We've had lots of interest, but unfortunately, I can't say how many official applications we've had.
Understood. Understood. All right. We also have Todd Stribley in the background who will stay on for the question and answer session. So please submit any other questions you have, audience. Thanks, Ed. We appreciate your time. And for anyone looking for Ed's contact information, you can just access this presentation online again and find it there in this final slide. With that, let's go to our final presentation, Otto van Geet. Otto, looks like your slides are up, so please proceed.
Yeah, hi everyone. Otto Van Giet from NREL. And what I'm going to cover today is requests for proposals focused on solar projects, but not limited to solar projects, and some related best practices. So next slide. So just a tiny bit of background on NREL, where Mark and I both work. We have about 2,000 employees. It's a picture of our campus in Golden, Colorado in the background. And we're, the world's leaders in lots of renewable technologies like Mark and I have talked about, solar, wind, and many others, and energy efficiency. We partner with industry, use our campus to as a living lab to deploy some of the things we research, and have a very large national economic impact related to our research and our projects. Next slide. So one of the reasons you might do a project is the community benefits of renewable development. And Mark focused on really large projects. I'm going to focus more on tribal-owned projects, which was one of the subsets of Mark's. This is a picture of a typical photovoltaic project in the background. But some of the benefits to tribes would be economic, potentially saving cost by creating your energy on site, or getting payments for the use of your land. Very importantly, and often misunderstood or misrepresented or underappreciated, is workforce development. And I'll mention that several times, but if tribal peoples can learn a skill such as installing a solar system, that can be a really important benefit to the tribe. You might have some land lease payments. Mark talked a lot about that. And you might be able to support some infrastructure upgrades, et cetera. And we just heard about some funding opportunity. With that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So the outline of what I really wanted to cover is the whole process of requests for proposals. And then I'll cover an RFP template that we've put together for tribal solar photovoltaic or PV systems, some RFP best practices, and then I'll summarize with some key takeaways. We'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so again, what is an RFP? It's a request for proposal. And it's kind of an industry standard document requesting written bids from qualified contractors. Both very important terms there. You want to make sure they're qualified. It enables the buyer, the tribe in this case, to conduct a bidding process to identify the best price or quality, and really value is what's the best value for the desired service. In this case, the service would be a PV system. Before you get to the RFP process, you've hopefully gone through a resource assessment process. Mark talked about that for wind. For solar, it's a little bit easier. Solar resources is less location dependent than wind, which is very location dependent. So typically you don't need to do a detailed solar study. I've presented on feasibility and planning at previous tribal energy webinars. So you can go back to that, as of others from NREL. The feasibility study is basically looking at, for the given resource and the cost of the energy you'd be displacing, do the economics make sense? And how would you finance it? Once you've gone through that step, now you're into the RFP process, which will be the focus of this presentation. After you've procured and built the system, you'll move into the system monitoring and O&M, or the life of the project, which is 25 plus years. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to focus on the RFP portion of this process, which will begin on the next slide, please. So the process I'll go through is these arrows up above. and a picture of the NREL wind site in the background, and a large PV system at the NREL wind site also, which is south of Boulder, Colorado. And I'll describe each of these steps in the upcoming slides. So go ahead. Next slide, please. So developing the RFP. For developing the RFP, you need to figure out what's the size and type of system you want to procure, where it's going to be located, how it's going to be interconnected, the criteria used to evaluate the proposals, and what are the project goals. You may need to develop, you will need to develop a packet of materials to allow vendors to make an informed bid. This includes a whole bunch of things like scope of work, site data, again, where it's going to be located, how large, etc. Project logistics, things like interconnection, how you're going to evaluate the bids, and the format that you're requesting for the request for proposals. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide and then talk about issuing of RFPs. So in issuing the RFP, some questions the tribe needs to think about is, how many responses does a tribe need? And basically more is better, especially qualified, experienced responses. Three, generally at least three, but two can be okay if they're comparable system scopes and comparable competitive prices. Once you develop the RFP, you need to promote it. So most importantly, notify local vendors directly, vendors in your area. Through the Tribal Energy homepage, you can advertise there. Through native news sites, through social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. And then also through local chapters of major industry groups, such as the Solar Energy Industries Association for solar projects, or American Wind Energy Association, OEA, if it was a wind project. So again, you want to issue it and promote that it's out on the street to request for proposals. Next slide, please. So once vendors have decided to respond, they may need some additional information or have questions about the project. You'll want to designate a point of contact that can field these questions in a timely manner. And it's important to engage the vendors. And one of the ways you can do that is potentially hosting a site walk so that the vendors can inspect the project site and look at, what is the land like, how easy will it be to build, go over all the questions they might have related to your request for proposals, possibly go over geotech information or look at roofs if it's PV on a existing roof for a building, all those kinds of things. The more knowledgeable the vendors and the easier you make it for them to submit a qualified bid, the less risk from their part, which is going to equate to better bids for the tribe and for the project. So once you talk about the administration, let's go ahead and move to the proposal evaluation stage. And when you've received proposals, you want to give them adequate time to prepare their proposals. A lot of them may be similar. And you want to look at the qualifications of the vendors, and objective evaluation is important. I'll cover it a little bit later, but in the template, we also do the RFP template. We include the first year of operation and maintenance of the system. So you want to look at how qualified are they for the O&M portion of the contract. And you can also schedule follow-up interviews if you have several proposals that are close and you want to see which agency you'd feel most comfortable working with. And probably most important on this slide is to award on best value, not just lowest cost. So best value is of course cost. You know, how much does it cost in dollars per kilowatt or dollars per kilowatt hour? But also what's the quality of the panels and inverters and interconnection that they're proposing. Have they done similar projects? Have they worked with tribal agencies before? Is there going to be some workforce development? All those kinds of things come into your decision. So it's not just cost. And you'll want to have that established beforehand and how you're going to weight those different criteria in evaluating the proposal. So very important step there is best value and how you're going to award. And then let's go to the next slide. So before you award the contract, in fact, long before, you need to get buy-in from key decision makers. Who's going to approve this? Does it need to go to tribal council? Those sorts of things. You don't want to have a project stall in the final hours if a key decision maker doesn't have a clear understanding of the project and its goals. So that's work that you have to do long before you're going to award the contract. Communicate your key contract terms ahead of time. And I list some examples of that, but construction timeline, workforce development, all those sorts of things that is going to be part of your contract. And by the way, the RFP that I'll talk about here in a minute will be part of your contract also. That is what they're proposing to with their request for proposals. And again, get tribal council involved for any legal requirements related to the RFP. So next slide. So to help this whole process, we at NREL developed a solar RFP template. There's a picture of the cover there and a link to it at the bottom of the slide. Please use it. We developed it and it has been used by many tribes. The focus, first, the audience is obviously tribes, but all kinds of solar projects. Could be roof mount, ground mount, carport, or any combination of those, with the goal of getting competitive bids and being able to award a best value contract. The RFP is for tribal owned projects. Mark talked extensively and very well about other contract options such as PPAs, so I'm not going to go over that. Again, it's a template, it's a starting point for tribes. You can reach out to Lizana or James or others if you need help with this. But I'll go through and show you how it's structured briefly on the next slide, please. Yeah, great. So this is just a copy of the first page. But what you want to do is fill out into the template all the things that are in blue. So you'll be able to do a search and replace to put things like tribe name and location and the types of systems and et cetera, et cetera. It's very self-explanatory. You'll want to put in other details about the project, maps, dates for when proposals are due, those sorts of things. You can also put in some other objectives such as job creation or training, economic benefits, basically why are you doing this? But it starts with a well-defined goals for the bidders and focuses on outcome metrics like production guarantees. How many kilowatt hours will this system produce and will you guarantee that production, for example? And we also provide some design guidelines in this template, for all three system types, roof mount, carport, and ground mount. So again, that's what the proposal, the RFP template looks like, and very much encourage you to use it. And I'll describe it a little more on the next slide, please. So some of the best practices that you'll want to include is to make sure you're very clear. Measure twice, cut once. Once you issue the RFP, it's going to lock you in to the project requirements. And you don't want to change it once a contract's been awarded. A change order will not be of the best economic value to a tribe typically. Consider a request for information. You can issue that first and see, if you have questions about something related to a possible solar project. Request enough information to make an informed decision, but not so much that vendors are discouraged from responding by the volumes of information requested. Said another way, you want to get them to provide a good bid, but they don't need to get into specifying every part and piece and detail in the bid. That'll come during the design and design review process, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And again, best value, not lowest cost for evaluation metrics. Next slide. So once you've issued the RFP and awarded the RFP, now you get into the construction phase. And it's really the design, the construction, and the operation phase. Really important to designate a construction project manager to coordinate all the bullets that I'll cover, but coordinating all the work with the design team and correspondence with the design team, design build team. And the design build team in solar terms is often called the engineering, procurement, and construction team, or the EPC team. That's just an industry term. So you're going to be awarding this to an EPC to design it, build it, and potentially operate it for a year. The project manager will also coordinate design submittal reviews at 75 and 100% design. And I put numbers to the right of each of these. That's section 5.1 in the RFP. Utility interconnection agreements, a quality control plan, inspection testing, and very importantly, commissioning. Project closeout and acceptance, including training. Training is very important. And then again, with the RFP is 1 year of operation and maintenance of the system. And this also allows the tribe to get up to speed on how to operate the system. These are all optional. This can all be modified by the tribe, but that's how the RFP template is laid out. So next slide. I've listed a bunch of resources here. I'm not going to read through most of them. I will cover the very bottom one. There's another federal PV procurement specification template with the link shown there. And that one is focused on PPA type solar agreements. So if that's the path that you're considering, look at that one. It's by part of DOE, but a portion called the Federal Energy Management Program. But another template to potentially use if you're going to do a PPA. And with that, next slide, which is the last slide. And this is my contact information. I like using this slide because it's a picture of all the solar systems on our campus. Some are owned by DOE/NREL, and some are PPAs. And you can see examples of ground mount, roof mount, garage mount, PV carports. All of them were done for cost competitive reasons. In other words, it met the mission of the buildings or the economics were favorable. And there's about 3.6 megawatts or so on this main South Table Mountain campus. We have another several megawatts at our Flatirons campus, a little bit north where I showed an image before. So with that, that's a great stopping point. And James, maybe we can turn it over for questions.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Otto. I appreciate it. And now is the time for questions for our entire panel. I have some here already, but audience, please do submit any that you have at the current time, and we'll hopefully have time to get to them. In regards to your presentation, Otto, thanks, excellent job. Just as an aside, in a past job, I used your template there for an RFP and found it very helpful. So it's just some real experience and feedback. It's a useful tool. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
That's why it was created, and I'm glad you used it.
Sure. Yeah, a lot easier than starting from scratch, that's for sure. First question here, and it's from Mark. Mark, early in your presentation, you talked about corporations buying large amounts of energy, renewable energy directly. Do you see that trend increasing, and do you have any idea at what rate it's increasing today?
Sure. Just a test here. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, I do see it increasing. As I mentioned, it's not just a 3-year-old trend. Back when I was doing this for a living, it was probably 10 years ago, we were starting to talk with Google and others. And I think it was an education process for them, I guess, and us. And then slowly that education process turned into actual contracts being signed, and then additional companies moving into the mix. And now, as I mentioned in my presentation, over the last 5 years, it's moved into 50%. There's two ways to 50% of the contracts being corporate contracts. There's two ways to measure that. One from a transaction perspective, and one from a megawatts perspective. And utilities are still winning the day on number of megawatts per year, but the trend for transactions being more from the corporate sector, that's continuing to rise over 50%. So yes, I do see it continuing. As far as a rate, I'm not going to be a prognosticator on that. So if Otto has his own guess, I'll let him guess, but I think it's going to continue to be strong.
Yep, I'm going to pass on that one, but thanks, Mark. But I will add a very brief comment is a lot of the big industry group associations, not associations, companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon and et cetera, have set very aggressive energy and carbon goals. And the way they're going to meet that is through projects like Mark and I have talked about. So I do see this continuing. They've made these commitments, so they now need to meet these commitments.
A follow on to this question: how do these corporations source their projects? Do they issue RFPs, or are they more, reaching out to large developers directly or landowners and doing a more organic sourcing of their projects?
I've seen both. I know there's a lot of bilateral contracts, and that it's maybe an industry term, but it's basically a private negotiation where you're knocking on doors as a wind developer, an asset owner, and you're striking a separate deal with them. I've also seen RFPs that have come out from the Amazons of the world. What's also, I probably don't want to get into this level of detail too much, but what's also important is working with the local utility. The term sleeving a PPA is often used, where they're buying the power from the developer. The corporation's buying the power from the developer, but there's a middleman, and it's usually the utility. And they'll charge kind of an admin fee. It's usually 3, 4, 5%, something like that. So it's a small amount to actually move the power through their system and use their ancillary services to make the project work, to make the contract work. they are motivated to do that because of their maternalistic or paternalistic view of their service territory, and they see that as jobs. They want the Amazons of the world to stay in their, these distribution centers are information centers, are heavy demand users, power users, and they want them to stay in their service territory, so they will bend over backwards to make a project work. And so the sleeving, that's the term, is accommodated by the utility to make the have the corporations meet their sustainability goals.
Thanks, Mark. A question here for the loan programs office. And Todd, it's maybe outside your wheelhouse, but let us know if you aren't able to answer. Can the loan program cover part or all of the design process as well as construction?
Yeah, James, thanks for passing that on. It depends on how far along, because a lot of that design process is part of the due diligence phase. So it really depends upon the maturity of the project as a whole. There's some portions of designs, yes, we can, but again, it gets back to that reasonable prospect of return and the maturity of the project. So it's a balancing act at that point in time. But be happy to go offline and delve into a little more details if folks need some more clarification on that.
Great, thanks, Todd. Oh, excuse me. Another question here. So many tribes have economic development goals and/or capacity building goals, and this is probably a question for Mark. What aspects of the deal do developers have the most flexibility? So where in the deal does the developer have the most flexibility to maybe help tailor the benefits to match the tribe's goal?
Yeah, I think, again, I go back to educate yourself for your region of the U.S., get a sense of what those economics, from a high level, what those general economics are of nearby projects, so that you make sure you're not asking for more than what the market can bear. And if there's you get a sense of what the average property tax revenue is for a wind project in your area, in your state, in your county, then that's a number you could ask for as a payment in lieu of taxes as a tribe. From a job creation perspective, I think that there have been a number of projects that have offered training for those that are interested in being a wind technician. I think that's an area where there's something you could ask. Again, I personally wouldn't want to be one of those O&M guys hanging off of a blade. One of those last pictures I showed. But for those that are interested in climbing towers and have strong legs and are mechanically inclined, you don't have to have a college degree for that. And frequently the training can be on site. I know that one of the first wind projects I worked on was in dairy country in Wisconsin, and the plant manager was a former plant manager at a cheese factory, and he put his resume in and was hired as the plant manager for the wind farm. It came along with some training, of course. And local people that had O&M experience and facilities experience came online and met up with the plant manager and were trained on site to provide maintenance for the wind farm. So I think those are a couple of areas.
Thanks, Mark. We have one last question here and just a little bit of time to answer it. So this is a question for Todd and the loan guarantee program. What's the interest on a tribal loan through your program, and is it fixed for the term of the loan? My guess is there's no specific answer, but maybe you can generalize it.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no specific answer because we're working with a commercial lender and guaranteeing the loan that that commercial lender provides. That the actual terms and the interest rates, and if it's by distribution, meaning if you have a 5-year project and you get 5 distributions to cover the construction costs during those 5 years, whether or not it's fixed or fixed at every distribution point at the end, then they're usually kind of merged together so you get a final interest rate. But because we're working with that commercial lender, the actual rate of the loan is negotiated during that due diligence phase of the process. And yeah, again, I know that's kind of a general answer there. So if folks do want to have some more discussions, yeah, please feel free to reach out to Ed or myself, and we can go into more details.
Great, thanks, Todd. At this point, there does not appear to be any other additional questions. So with that, I want to thank all of our presenters again for their time and excellent presentations. To our audience, we are very interested in your suggestions on how to strengthen the value of this training. So please send us your feedback. On our final slide here, we show the remaining webinars of the 2020 series. The next webinar, titled Tribal Microgrids, Exploring Why and How, will be held on October 28th at this same time, 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you again for all of your interest and attendance. We look forward to having you join us on future webinars. This concludes the webinar for today. Good day.
Everybody.
Take care. Thank you.